Hello, everyone. It's a great joy to be with you today and with Sami. And we are starting the Majlises again. This is the first of the summer term. When some minutes ago, Sami switched on his camera and joined the meeting. He asked me how I was, and I said, "Now I'm very well. Seeing you, I am very well. I wasn't that well before, but now." Being with Sami and being with you is really a great joy. And so one of the last jobs when setting up a majlis is to think what to say, how to introduce our guest. And though what I want to say is fairly simple, this time I felt that it's better if I write it down. So I will actually read my introduction.
Don't go too far.
But before that, I want to thank also Ismail, because it is due to Ismail that I met Sami in Sharjah. So thank you for Ismail for your friendship and the friendship of Sami. So Sami has a loving and lovable personality, and his research reflects the colorfulness of his soul. His intelligence is supremely high, and his wisdom is equally deep. Thus, he is modest without emphasizing his modesty. It is manifest in his gentle, easy simplicity, which is light like light. I'm eager to hear, submerge in, and enjoy what he has to share with us today. So, that was fairly short.
That was amazing. I mean, I can promise you, everybody here, I didn't pay him. I didn't pay him for saying all these nice words about me. You know, I mean, I don't have many people saying all these nice words about me all the time, so it's quite taken aback. But thank you so much for the introduction.
Well, Sami, it's done. Now you're yeah. Please talk,
Right.
talk first about yourself, and then
right. Yes. I mean, I'm pleased to be here, and thank you, Isfan, and thank you also, Ismail. This being quite a journey of the topic that we are going to talk about today. I hope you enjoy it, and it also stems from my career in a way, which has been always like wearing a couple of hats in a way, between museums and academia. But also in terms of interest. So the Islamic world as a whole, the culture of the Islamic world, past and present, but also most importantly, and that's probably the main topic that we are going to discuss today, is the interactions of the Islamic world with non-Islamic entities. And so this has brought to me being interested in especially in the area of the Mediterranean Islam, with the sort of interactions that the Islamic polity has had throughout the Middle Ages, I would have thought, primarily with non-Islamic entities, and the very interesting type of, artistic cross-pollinations that have happened because of it. And so in everything that I do, from my teaching at the University of Sharjah, but even before with the type of exhibitions I've had at the British Museum, but also in the Middle East, I've always tried to incorporate this aspect of Islam, i.e., looking outward and back. And it's interesting because obviously people have done it in different ways. They've studied more in terms of like 19th century and onwards, of course, the effect of Orientalism that Orientalism has had on Islam, and vice versa. You have Stephen Vernois, who studied Occidentalism and how Islam in a way was interested culturally in the West, and how that has manifested itself within the Islamic world. So my experiences are, I was for many years teaching in the UK, first at SARS, then I worked for 2 years at the University of Oxford in a Khalili Research Centre. afterwards, I was working also for the British Museum in various guises, especially in the Middle East departments, with some sort of ventures that the Middle Eastern department had entertained with organizations in the Middle East, especially in Abu Dhabi. Then I worked in Dubai for a couple of museums, on a couple of ethnographic museums. I then went to Kuwait, and that's where I met Ismail Berhani. We worked together in the Islamic Science Museum of the Abdullah Salem Cultural Center. Then COVID struck, and I had to make a decision, and I moved to the Emirates at the University of Sharjah, where I've been since 2021. So that's for me. And if you don't mind, I can start with the talk now.
Sami, if you could speak a bit about why did you start these studies at all, and from your background, maybe even family, what brought you into the field, and also on the challenges of because that's a special career, this museum and academia.
Yes.
So art and yeah, and written and written craft and not unwritten craft. How do they? Yeah,
that's right. So I mean, to be honest, I was always interested in non-European cultures, you know, not just Islam, but also Japan, China, India. What's so particularly interesting me, I mean, there's some sort of personal interest because my family had ties to the Middle East. In particular, you know, I had a great uncle who was the first director of the opera in Cairo. The opera in Cairo was the first opera in the Middle East and in Africa. And so I had documents from him when he spent his time there, a couple of years. You know, I was very pleased to find also, this is a long time ago, and recently I found out that, you know, Edward Said actually has got, I think there was a new posthumous book, I think it's called Said and Opera. But essentially Edward Said, in very famous paper that he published about the Aida, the opera that Verdi composed for Khalil Ismail, he talks about the rivalry that my uncle had with Verdi, and how Verdi didn't want him to conduct, you know, this opera in Cairo. So there's a lot of, like, you know, different anecdotes, but since, you know, I was a kid, I always had, you know, many Arab friends, and I really felt that somehow Islamic culture and Islamic civilization were not getting the right somehow recognition, and I never thought that, you know, just because we have the Eiffel Tower or the Statue of Liberty or the Colosseum in the West, I never thought that the monuments of the East were any sort of less relevant to today's world. So I decided then, you know, to get into this field because, I mean, I didn't say as a mission, I was just passionate about it. I mean, there was no savior type of moment that I had, but it's just that my passion was stemmed from all these different factors. Then I got a scholarship to study first Middle Eastern history and then Middle Eastern art, and you know, there I met, you know, fantastic people like Doris Abu Saif, you know, Doris Abu Saif and Nasser Rabat, you know, the two basileus of Cairo and Mamluk, the Mamluk civilization. I really sort of was interested in Egypt, so my focus then became Egypt and somehow, you know, the Holy Lands and Mecca, Medina. And so some of my latest ventures, especially when it comes to publications, have dealt with, you know, Mecca, Medina, the sort of like material culture, you know, from Mecca, Medina, like the keys of Medina, or in some textiles, and some of the calligraphers who've been the calligraphers of the mosque in Medina. So yeah, I mean, there's so many aspects, and you know, the what you just mentioned about, you know, working in a museum and working in academia. I mean, somehow, especially for someone like me that loves history, and because I think that through history you can explain a lot of current, if you like, situations. I found that link also in museums, because obviously the type of curation, the type of exhibitions that I've dealt with are always of an historical nature. So that for me, where I mean, there was no big difference. I know that some academics, for example, they always look down on curators. I don't know, he's just a curator, you know, not to take them seriously. But I happen to think that, in fact, if you work for a museum and you do it in an academic way, I mean, I see no difference between the work of an academic and a work of somebody who works in history, but through a museum. So I think that's a seamless sort of like transition for me, you know, back and forth. I've never had any problems with that. So, yeah.
And I think that you may, as a curator, you may reach more audience often than as an academic in this mission of sharing our common
it's also about, you know, the
Islamic,
different, of course, but it's also about the different sort of levels of, like, you know, spreading that knowledge. So maybe through an academic paper, your audience is of a certain education, from so background, and maybe if you prepare and work on an exhibition that is reaching obviously the masses, the level of depth that you need to go into the same sort of topics is going to be slightly different. So it's a bit of an art in itself to do that, to regulate that level. And I think, you know, and that's why, you know, some historical exhibitions are not being very successful, because they were very specific and they didn't reach, or they didn't speak to the masses. And that's happened, you know, in my lifetime of the exhibitions I've seen. It's happened many times. And I think which were not explained to the public, and things that I probably could understand, but some people didn't. So it lives sometimes a gap. So it's very complex to navigate, you know, the two worlds, but, you know, through a bit of effort.
And teaching in Sharjah and living in the Middle East as a Italo-English,
it's interesting. It's interesting as well, because obviously the type of people that you meet, the type of students that you have, you know, they've got different sort of interests compared to the ones in Europe or the West, and it's, you know, I think the outcome is more or less the same, but the sort of interest that people might have are quite different. Maybe the students that I was, you know, in contact with when I was in the UK, for example, I always felt that there is that passion for anything non-European, and I felt, you know, I had that in me when I was a student myself. Here is a bit of the opposite, you know. I mean, Dr. Sami, why do you like it here? Why are you here? You know, I mean, wasn't it better for you in Europe, or, like, you know? But it's obviously they're interested, and you know, why do you speak Arabic? Where did you learn it? Why? You know, those sort of questions are interesting, because I'm like, you know, for me, when I was in London, you know, dealing with these guys from SARS, for example, it's like, you know, I'm like, you know, one of the many. But then you come here, and there is a group of us, and it's not that many, you see. So the circle of people with like similar interests is not that big. It's a bit strange, because you would have thought that probably you would find more people here. There are some, of course, but it's not that big circle that you could imagine to be. The interests are different. I think there is a very clear I would say shift in terms of people here being very interested in everything modern and contemporary. I think that's a lot stronger compared to, you know, this sort of like traction in the West. You don't have it as much. I think in Western universities, at least, you know, the ones that I've been acquainted with, you find many students that actually want to revisit the past in a very strong way. Here, everything is about, you know, being modern, being contemporary, being current, and doing that also by incorporating, you know, say, for example, an art student or design students incorporating part of their heritage now, but it's very new to them. So the fact that their heritage is something that is worth of, you know, spending time on, studying and trying to incorporate it into something modern is something very new to them. And it's good because it's coming quite, you know, I think probably in the last 5-10 years, there's a very strong current of thought within Middle Eastern thinkers, which promotes that, and it's a very good thing. But in terms of like the students and practitioners as well, it's something very new. So they're sort of getting adjusted to it. But you see all these great examples there. You know, I mean, the one in Kuwait I was working with, Ismail, was one big example, but, you know, the many in Saudi, in Qatar, in the Emirates, in Egypt, these are all big cultural, you know, pursuits whereby, you know, governments, people, organizations, civil society, they're moving into the directions where they want that past to be recognized. They want to get rid of those shackles that, you know, for centuries have told them, look, you know, anything of interest comes from the West. So that's finally gotten there, and people are reacting in different ways. Some people are doing it in a very organic way. Some people are, you know, just for a break with the past in a very abrupt way, and you get different outcomes. But nevertheless, it's there in all its form, and I think it's something that needs to be cherished, something new.
Yeah, and I guess the difficulty may be that how to revive this past without falsifying it and simplifying it. But what happens anyway everywhere. But this is also
Yeah, I mean, there is that risk, you know, what I call the Disneyfication of culture, you know.
yeah.
So you want to, and some people here, I mean, I see one person that obviously has experience in the UAE, and that's the risk that people, you know, encounter, unfortunately, because, you know, do we want to incorporate that and make it new? And so that's the Disneyfication of, you know, a specific project, or do we want to make sure that we preserve the spirit, but maybe people would know that that's old, and, you know, the building is old, or even oral history, you know, a game that was played, you know, 200 years ago, we don't have any rules. So do we need to sort of transmit it to new generations in an oral way, or do we write rules for this game? But, you know, if you do that, you're sort of like looking at the past with the eyes of today. And so if I knew that, you know, the grandmother sort of taught the grandkids this game just by explaining it, you know, the rules in a verbal way, and you're writing them down, you know, it's not exactly the same thing.
Well, this is supremely interesting. Thank you, Sami. Yeah, let's move to your topic of today.
Yes.
But it's just interesting how you became from someone who wanted to share the values, what we share anyway, but we don't know, from Islamic culture, Middle Eastern culture in the West, and then going to the Middle East and show these values there, and
the perception is very different. So the perception, the reception as well, you know. So I feel that because of years of mental colonization, you know, rather than physical. I feel that people, for them, is just something new. For many people, but it's something good. It's a good movement, and I think it should be supported by everybody, people within the culture, people outside the culture. You know, when people become mentally independent, it's always a good thing, wherever they are.
Yes, yes. It is interesting for just I remember Goldsey had writing that he experienced that in the Middle East people didn't care about things which were old for being old. So it is also our idea of appreciating something, the oldness of something is not necessarily something which is universal, and and I don't think it was always the case in Europe as well. Like,
I mean,
in
it's also
music.
very selective, because if you go to places like Egypt, for example, you know, they're great when it comes to, you know, the remembrance of pharaonic Egypt, ancient Egypt,
Yeah.
of course, but all the other civilization that came after Egypt, so the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, the Copts, the Arabs, the Muslims, the Turks, a bit less. But even that has been, there's been a change, you know, in the past 30, 40 years. I mean, if you looked at the great Islamicists that was specializing in Egypt, you know, 100 years ago, that all of them foreigners. Whereas now, you know, the big scholars are all, you know, originally Egyptians, maybe in Europe, or Syrians, or, you know, Nasser Rabat and Doris Abou-Saif, as I mentioned before, these two great titans of Egyptian history. You know, of course they studied abroad, but they're both, you know, one is Egyptian, the other one is Syrian. So
actually, this reminds me of something which links, which opens your topic of today. That I remember when, for my own life and career, I think probably the most decisive impact was when I went to Cairo with my mother, and then we visited, as everyone, the ancient Egyptian splendid and unique civilization, which I loved. But there was also part of the tour showing some things in the Qala, and including the Muhammad Nasir
yes,
Mosque. And I remember that green dome, and I remembered from the Arabian Nights also this idea of the green dome. And I was equally impressed by the Islamic architecture than by the ancient Egyptian. And then much later, when I went back for research, I found out that Cairo is the city which has the most medieval monuments in the world, which very, very few people know. So it's incredibly rich.
I mean, not just Cairo, but the whole of, you know, I think they've got treasures hiding in plain sight, in a way. So and they're there to be discovered. You know, you go to the Qala, as you mentioned, and unfortunately, because of, you know, I think some of these monuments, obviously, recently they're being renovated also with, you know, in a good way, restored and you know, in a tasteful way. But, you know, for a very long time, this was not happening. So there is this thrust again, you know, to take care of this part of their history. It's, as I said, can only be a good thing. Right. So,
Yeah,
which
go
brings
ahead,
me
please.
to my talk today. So my talk today, I mean, my interest in this topic is, you know, stems from different things, obviously. The main thing is that because obviously you can do desktop research as much as you like. You can read Cresswell, you can read Nasser Rabat and Doris Abou-Saif, but if you don't go and touch, you know, monuments and objects, your knowledge, especially that feeling, you know, the blood, sweat, and tears that you have when you go there under the heat and things, it's it's going to be a bit limited, a bit, you know, clinical. And there are certain things that you can't learn from books. And I've been inspired by, you know, obviously some of the scholars that they did that before me. I'm a nobody compared to them. But this goes probably in the same direction. And, you know, I learned a lot, you know, throughout the years that I've been researching this, because it's not been an easy topic, to say the least. So the title is Understanding Text in Stone, a History of Christian Symbols in Mamluk Architecture. So it tells you a lot. You know, you have the civilization in Egypt, where, you know, great empires have come and gone, you know, the empires of the pharaohs, the Greeks, Islamic, and the Muslims, and the Copts, and they all left traces. Then you have the Mamluks, who are basically, they're a bit of a hybrid type of people. You know, they're Turks, but they learn Arabic and they learn Islam from the Arabs. So they come with a very, you know, with a fervor that you don't normally find in people who actually are born Muslims. They're converts. They're first slaves, and then, you know, they become Muslims. And they're also elected or selected as vizier, even as a sultan. So it's a very unique sort of background. And so this, in 2018, me and my colleague, Nikolaos Virizidis, decided to tackle an issue that was important to both of us. You know, I mean, Nicholas looked at things probably in a very similar way, but from the other side. So he looks more at the Christians and the impact that, specifically in Greece, you know, Islam had throughout the years, Islamic collections in Christian monasteries. And we realized that there was no publication that dealt with specifically, in terms of books, obviously, not with something like, you know, cross-pollination in terms of cultures, you know, like, you know, style of a mosque that looked like a church. No, we are talking about not cultural, but specifically religious. So a Christian object or a monument that has been transformed into an Islamic one, and vice versa. So, you know, things like Islamic objects, you know, from the Fatimid period, they've gone to Italy, and they now serve a liturgical type of purpose, like, you know, the rock crystal ewers that contain the relics of the saints in Venice and in Urbino and other places. And so we put this together. It became like a panel at the AAH 2018, the Association of Art Historians. And then we talked to all the contributors, all the people who presented in that occasion. We decided to make a book out of it, which is hopefully going to be published this year, probably in a couple of months. We're just waiting for the images, the medieval Mediterranean between Islamic and Christianity, cross-pollinations in art, architecture, and material culture. And if you read the blurb by the American University of Cairo Press, and it's all about what you read here. 13 international scholars talking about what I just mentioned. So the aesthetic space between Islam and Christianity. When does an object, you know, cease to be Islamic and become Christian, and vice versa? And these are all the contributors. You have Paskalis Androudis and Nikolaos Virizidis talking about a very interesting candlestick from Mosul that you know, the Orthodox Church just stuck a beautiful cross on top of it. So it's very much a hybrid type of object. Farouk Biligi and Helen Fagaki, they deal with a very interesting case of 3 plaques of, I think they were made at the time of Constantine, the emperor of Byzantium, that they were used in the Mosque of Suleiman in Istanbul. Maria Bonpudaki, she writes about the bacini in Greece and Crete. Bacini were basically Islamic plates, ceramic plates. They were inserted into the facades of some medieval churches, specifically in Italy, some of them in Germany, some of them in France. I remember seeing the ones in Pisa. Hani Hamza, he discusses the balsam, the holy balsam of Matareya, which was traded initially by the Christians, and then when the Mamluks arrived, they sort of like take patronage of that production and they distribute the balsam to Christian and Muslims alike, also as presents. Ana Cabrera, she deals with Islamic textiles in Spain. Alison Arthur, who's the executive director of the Royal Asiatic Society, she's a specialist on book bindings of the Islamic world and the transition to Europe, how, you know, something that was made for a Quran inspired the cover for a Bible, some of the Islamic bindings that were used in Europe. Richard McClary from the University of York deals with mukanas in Christian settings, specifically, I think, Armenia and Georgia. Nino Simonshvili, again, she deals with a church in Georgia that's been heavily claimed to be influenced by Islamic art in that part of the world. Very interesting. I don't know if anybody's been to Georgia, but that's a region of Georgia next to Turkey, Ajara, that has some beautiful wooden mosques. And Ariel Winnick, she deals with Coptic burial rites and the textiles used in them and their Arabic inscriptions. Of course, this is not something that only happens in Cairo, in Egypt. It's not something that happened only with Islam or with the advent of Islam. It's something that's happening even today. The changes of function of monuments and objects. I've just brought two very big, obviously, examples of monuments. I have examples also of objects. See how this is not really history. We're talking about the present times, things that happen today. So you have a medieval example, of course, of the Great Panther. I mean, these are probably two of my favorite monuments that I've ever seen in my life. And it's great because I think the reason why I partly admire them is, of course, the beauty and the near perfection of their architecture, but I'm also talking about, their history, lives and afterlives. It's the Pantheon, of course, pagan, then Roman, then a Christian, and even in its Christian sort of like iteration, you have the tomb of Raphael, probably the greatest painter ever lived, and it's like, what's his connection with Christianity? Yes, he's probably the painter of great sort of Christian themes, I suppose. One Imbrera with the Dome of the Rock, the temple. But in terms of his affiliation with the Christian church, is very tenuous. So you wonder, there's this mix, and of course, the Hagia Sophia, church, mosque, museum, then mosque again. So these are, I mean, we should really not see this as something that is not going to happen again, because it will happen, as culture is not a static entity, but rather an evolution of human minds. So that is obviously part of it. So you have the change of function, the change of it's a new life. It's a new life. I don't know if you ever read the book by Orhan Pamuk called The White Castle, My castle is about this identical to, and you know that there is I don't know if it's true, but there's this theory that we have 8 people that in the world that look exactly like us. And so Rampamu novels, starts from with that sort of in mind. And there is this, I think it's a merchant in Venice and somebody that works at the court of Slimane, and they basically identical. And they meet in Istanbul and they decide to swap their lives. And it's very interesting because the Turk goes to Venice and the Venetian goes to Istanbul. So it's interesting. So that was part of it, the different nature of monuments and object and material culture. The second one is that, I always thought that objects, monuments, material culture, because it would stand in most cases, the elements, in some way better than people, obviously, they can tell us a lot about people, about eras, society, politics, economics. One very good example is the Baptistère de Saint-Louis. There is this masterpiece of Islamic metalwork. It's an object that was made probably for Sultan al-Baybars in Cairo. And it's got all these Mongol and Mamluk-looking viziers and people on a horse. So the chap in the central medallion here has always reminded me a bit of Saint Mark. In this medallion, he sort of slays the bear, it looks like, and the second one it's a dragon. And we know it as the Baptistère. Now, it's an Islamic object. Why do we know it as a Baptistère? It's because it was taken and used probably as the Baptistère to baptize kids from the royal families. And the other weird thing that the maker, the metal worker who's responsible for this masterpiece, signed it 7 times, I believe. Amal al-Muallim Muhammad bin al-Zain. So he knows that this is a masterpiece. So he knows it and he signs it 7 times. Mind you, this is a time 100 years probably before the Renaissance, before the great star artists, Raphael, as I mentioned, one of them, many. And it was not customary for a craftsman from the Islamic world to sign his works. I mean, this is something that happened later, maybe, by Muslim craftsmen, artists being influenced by the Renaissance in places like Venice and Florence. Nevertheless, he signed, and it's something quite daring because we do know that the relationship when it comes to art and craft production in the Islamic world, especially at that time, the commissioner, the person who commissioned the work, the patron, is a lot more important than the architect or the maker in this case. And so the mosque of Sultan Hassan, the mosque of Nasir Muhammad, is not the mosque of Mimar Ahmed, for example. It's the mosque of the owner, of the person who paid for that mosque. Something very different. And this obviously tells us a lot about the difference between Islam and Christianity, because you don't have a church in Islam. So the mosques, these beautiful objects, they're not commissioned by a priest or by the Pope. They're commissioned by secular rulers. They're commissioned by the civilian elite. You have these fantastic examples of soft furnishing, that they, from one context, all of a sudden, they appear in a completely different guise, and you wonder, well, what happened there? And so this is the famous Pisa Griffin. You have the original in the Museo of the Opera in Pisa. And then a copy, obviously the original was there until the 1800s, I believe, on top of the Pisa Cathedral. And then they made a copy, because obviously of the weather, and it sits on top. So you have clearly an Islamic object. You have all the inscriptions here in Kufic talking about this object. It might have been some sort of primordial automata He's got a sister type of sculpture called the Maricha Lion in the Louvre Abu Dhabi. It used to be in Hong Kong, and then the Louvre Abu Dhabi acquired it. So it's interesting to see all these movements. Why did they move? You know, obviously there is, I mean, I understand that especially Europe during the Renaissance, you know, saw the Islamic world, you know, with, you know, as with fascination. It wasn't a time like the 19th century where this relationship of hierarchical, pyramidal, one would say, was there. It was more like respect and admiration. But then possibly the example that fascinated me the most, they inspire me to look at monuments in a different way, not just by looking at primary sources, Makrizi and Ibn Khaldun, and all these great historiographers of the medieval Islam, is an article written by Crystal Kessler. Crystal Kessler was an Islamicist who was probably the most famous student of Archibald Creswell in Cairo. And so she was very methodical in looking at the buildings, studying them. And, you know, she used to draw these fantastic ground plans. And so when you go to the main street here, you know, Shar al-Mu'izz Lidinillah in Cairo, she noticed that, you know, the orientation of the Qibla and the orientation, the positioning of the mosques and mausoleum in the Kasaba of Cairo, it was a bit weird. And she noticed that, you know, they had to adjust the facade to make sure that especially the Qubba, the dome, was facing the main street, right? And you had this very weird elongated windows. And she was wondering about, you know, what could have been the reason? This is something that is not mentioned by Makrizi. It's not mentioned by Ibn Iyas. It's not mentioned by all these great, again, you know, writers who normally talked about the minutiae of these monuments. So she was wondering why that, and she came out with a very interesting idea, which obviously has been sort of taken up by many different scholars, including Nasser Abad and Doris Abu Saif, which is the fact that they used to give precedence to the mausoleum of the deceased, and they had these windows for the passers-by, because when the passers-by would go in front of these windows and they knew that that person was buried there, they would recite the Fatiha, they would recite, you know, prayers upon the deceased. And so Shajara Dur, the wife of Hassan al-Najmuddin, and also the person who was responsible for the building of his mausoleum, thought that it would be a good idea that the person who was there, buried there, would get some barakah, you know, from that prayer, you know, would get some blessings. I mean, it's speculation, but it's not a wild speculation, because you see that all of them have these very weird orientations. Shajara Dur went also to greater length. She placed a mausoleum, you know, within the area of the mausoleums of the Holy Family, of the relatives of Prophet Muhammad, that the Fatimid had installed in that part of Cairo. And so she wanted passers-by not just to give it barakah, but to think that she was related to those people. And again, this is something that you don't find in history books, but you have to, you know, come to a conclusion by looking at what's been happening. They sort of patronage type of trends and patterns. Of course, you can tell a lot of other things as well. You know, the fact that, you know, Salah ad-Din is venerated in Egypt, in Syria, by somebody who's done so much, but he's not the person who liberated Jerusalem and put an end to the evil crusaders. No, it wasn't him. And he came to Cairo in great pomp and destroyed the Fatimids, because he completely hated them. You know, he thought that they were heterodox, and he had to bring back Sunnism. And so the whole Qala is Qala Salahuddin. But then the person, the Sultan, who really put an end to the Crusader states, Al-Ashraf Khalil, you know, the son of Sultan Khalawun, his mausoleum is very small. You know, nobody even knows who Al-Ashraf Khalil is. So it's also about the things that they tell you, but also about the things they don't tell you. Yes, this is a quote from a book which is a collection of papers and articles published throughout the years by Nasir. And so, I mean, I really liked it. The most enduring testament to the Mamluk Sultanate is its architecture. Not only do Mamluk buildings embody one of the most outstanding medieval architectural traditions, Mamluk architecture is actually a key to the social history of the period. Analyzing Mamluk constructions as a form of communication and documentation, as well as a cultural index, Mamluk history can be studied through architecture, as the latter shows how the buildings mirror the complex and historically unique military, political, social, and financial structures of the society of the period. So you're not just looking at the building, you're looking at a Polaroid of that era when you study that building. And so there are many cases, probably, I mean, I have a couple of them on this presentation, of insertion of Christian architectural elements into mosques of Cairo of the Mamluk period. And it's interesting for me to read, you know, some of these historians who, you know, they always want to appear being very cold and detached from the events of the day. But sometimes, you know, when something that, you know, strikes the nerve with their predisposition, you see them very excited. And so, you know, this is a Gothic portal inserted into the madrasa of Al-Nasir Muhammad and Kitbugha in the Kasaba. You know, is it this great portal? I mean, it's okay, but Makrizi is, I mean, probably you need another majlis to talk about Makrizi, but he calls it out, it's amazing. It's the most beautiful in the world. I mean, yes, I mean, I made the comment, you know, the fact that it's white marble, and white marble, of course, it's beautiful to look at, but, you know, this is literally being taken off a Crusader church in Akko, in Acre, and taken to Cairo. So maybe this is the reason, you know, and he's not very excited when some of these columns were taken from Coptic churches. You know, he talks about the trade, and I'm going to give you some of the examples. But maybe the reason why he thinks it's so beautiful is because it's been taken from a monument that represents, you know, the enemy Christians, not the good Christians. And so the Christians who are at war with the Muslims, you know, the evil crusaders. Whereas, you know, our Christians, the Copts, are they good? So we need to be careful on how we use, you know, church remains and church elements like columns, and you know, there were strictures, and I'm going to talk about those in a second. I don't remember all the cases, so apologies, I'll have to read them. But that's an interesting case, and I thought it exemplifies, you know, in a way, the reaction and perception and reception that some scholars of that time, you know, we're talking about, you know, the intelligentsia of that time would have had when they saw these very strange hybrids. Some of the examples are mainly, you know, utilitarian. You know, you have a fantastic slab that's been cut to perfection here, and it's got this cross at the back. So the craftsmen, what they do, they realize, you know, the quality of the slab. They turn it. They have this beveled type of decoration, very famous during the late 15th century, and they use it as a shardiwan. Shardiwan is the exterior part of a fountain, you know, for a sabil. Obviously, a fountain, you know, the fountains that the Muslims have is very different from European fountains. So, and this was used for water. But you know, my assumption is this was used mainly because of the quality of the craft. Some other examples, you know, the mosque of Amr in Fustat, you know, the first mosque in Africa, and the Nilometer are the first two examples of spolia, Christian spolia, being used in Muslim monuments in Cairo and Fustat at that time. So I think in the case of Amr, you have a lot, quite, you know, very large numbers of columns coming from Said, Upper Egypt, but not necessarily from churches only. So you have them from churches and you have them from pharaonic temples. It was a very large mosque, you know, there's a very large number of columns, so it was very natural that, you know, these columns would be taken from existing monuments. Same thing goes for the Nilometer. Some of the columns are taken from Coptic churches. Nilometer was this monument that was made to measure the rising of the water of the Nile. Specifically, you know, it became very famous also to determine the festivity of the Shem and Nassim, the inundation of the Nile. That signified, you know, this fertility for the country, and obviously it would mean that Egyptian fallahin would be able to collect their crops. Maybe the most famous of the case, it's quite ironic because it's the case of a mosque that doesn't contain columns. So people were surprised. Why is it that the Mosque of Ibn Tulun does not contain any of the columns? And, you know, there's different stories and histories related to it, with people, you know, claiming, you know, different things. Ibn Tulun was a Turk. He was a general in the Abbasid army, so he came from Baghdad, and he probably wanted to replicate the same style that he saw in Samarra and Baghdad without columns. Now, that's a very good justification. I don't know if I buy into it. There's also the case where I think an Egyptian scholar claimed that the person who was in charge, the Mimar, who was in charge of the mosque, was a Coptic person. And so because of that, you know, Ibn Tulun didn't want to take columns away from churches. But there's a whole discussion on the permissibility of taking elements from churches during the Islamic period, and Makrizi details many of them, and I just want to mention a couple of them to you. So the debate around Muslims reusing architectural materials from Christian monuments in mosques was continuously addressed by Islamic notables, and the Mamluk period was no exception. In Egypt, the majority of official rulings were not opposed to using elements from churches in a mosque, as long as those materials were acquired in a legal manner. So what is this legal manner? So Makrizi mentioned that the Christians who had become Muslims converted the churches they prayed in into mosques. In some cases, they used architectural elements from those churches in newly built mosques. This was a natural consequence when numerous Christians embraced Islam in the upper Egyptian region. There also seem to have been strict rules for using these elements from churches. The church must have been abandoned, and all churches in use before Muslim conquered Egypt could not have been demolished. Whereas restrictions imposed on Christians were mainly placed for construction of new churches, which required special and previous approvals from the government. Makrizi also narrates that the different ways of acquiring remains from Christian buildings. A relevant case study analyzed by him was the construction of the mosque in Giza by Muhammad ibn Allah al-Khazin under the order of the Emir Ali ibn Ikhshid, so the Ikhshidid times, in the year 961. When Al-Khazin entered one of the churches in Giza at night, he ripped out the columns and moved them to the mosque under construction. Upon learning this, Sheikh Abul Hassan al-Tahawi decided not to pray in the mosque anymore, as he thought he might have incurred an act of wrongdoing if he continued to do so, after learning of the forced acquisitions of the columns. Another sheikh, called Al-Yamini, mentioned that Al-Tahawi used to pray in the Mosque of Fustat, the Mosque of Amr, which contained columns and marble from the churches of Alexandria and the Egyptian provinces. The second story implies that the columns and marble in the Mosque of Fustat were acquired by legal means because he didn't mind praying there. Al-Wahhab mentions that this is a well-known fact, that the columns and capitals of this mosque were acquired through the prevalent commerce and architectural materials from churches, confirming that Al-Tahawi's issue with the mosque in Giza was mainly related to the means of acquisitions of the columns. The Islamic scholar Al-Zarkashi, writing in the 14th century, also emphasized the illegality of appropriating elements from an old building or an abandoned church without consent from the owner. He explained that the process by saying that an approved transaction was one in which Muslims would become owners of either a former religious buildings or architectural elements from it if bought legally, implying that they, the Muslims, had to have a binding contracts with the current owner and that all the parties had to agree to the transaction. Yeah, so these are, I mean, I found many examples of this, but I thought, you know, I'd just give you an assage of really what was going on. And so, yes, there was demolition and of mosques, and some people disregard this rule, but it was important for me to see that these rules were in place, and also when and why they were sort of circumvented, but also when and why they were applied. And I think, you know, ultimately it really depended on depending on the ruler. So if the ruler wanted to apply those regulations, then they would be applied. If he didn't care, then you know, people would acquire these architectural elements without any prior approval. Now, the case that interested me the most from the start was the case of some of the columns that I saw the very first time I visited the Qala. And this is the mosque that our colleague, Dr. Isman, was talking about. And it's the mosque of maybe the most famous, the most successful of the Mamluk sultans, Al-Nasir Muhammad ibn Qalawun. He had a very long rule. I think he ruled from around 40 years. He was a demagogue, but he sort of like his interests lied in different things. He was a patron of the Sufis in Syracuse in Egypt. He built the Great Iwan. He built the Striped Palace, the Ablak Palace in Cairo, opposite this mosque. And then you know, over the course of probably 20 years, he built this mosque. And this mosque, you know, if you look at the plan, there's nothing specifically, you know, unusual about it. You know, there wasn't a restriction in terms of space. This is not a mosque that has a mausoleum. It was a Friday mosque that he used when he was residing in the palace, in the Qala. And so the plan is very symmetrical in a way. And you have all these columns in the prayer hall and the courtyard. And it's got all these very nice marble mosaics on the wall and the prayer niche. Then I started looking at the columns, and I sort of noticed that, you know, some of them are, some of them are pharaonic, some of them are Christians, and some of the Christian ones are features that are not shown in other mosques, to my knowledge, in Cairo. So one of them is that normally, if you go to Al-Azhar or other, you know, the Sistans in Alexandria, they do have all these so Coptic type of columns. You will see that the cross and any other Christian symbols are either been defaced or erased, but the ones here haven't. And I was wondering why. And there seemed to have been some sort of pre-intentional thinking process, because, you know, when Muslims pray towards the Qibla of Makkah, they're not facing the cross, right? So the cross are placed in a way not to face the Musallin when they're praying. So I think somebody must have thought about it. And then, you know, I started reading more and more about this, and I looked at the annals of the French la communauté des monuments de Caire that worked on the restoration of these monuments during the, you know, late 19th century and early 20th century. And I came across a lot of documents, they talk about this, and these are not, so the way they are today, where it was exactly the way as they found it. And I started reading more and more about, you know, Nasser Muhammad and also the other Mamluk sultans, you know, if they had interests, you know, there were some sort of esoteric interests. And then I read, you know, the passage that Al-Makrizi and sorry, I wanted to say Dinawari. Just 1 second. There's a second historian that goes into depth about these columns. Al-Dawadari, sorry, I don't know why it was Dinawari. Dinawari is the historian who goes with Omar to Persia, I think, and he talks about the Futuhat in Persia. So Dawadari and Al-Makrizi, both of them, they talk about this, you know, humongous columns that they've been brought by, you know, the adjutants of the sultans from Upper Egypt, from the south of Egypt, to the citadel, and this was the work of a jinn because they were too big, and you know, it was said that the marble was not marble but was a magic potion. And I started getting very interested because obviously this was quite unique in the panorama of, you know, quite weird constructions in Cairo. And so I started reading about the place where these, because all the columns of this mosque come from one place, and this place is Al-Ashmunayn. Al-Ashmunayn in Upper Egypt, the Greek Hermopolis Magna, So the city of Hermes. So this sort of rang a bell to me because I've read about Hermopolis Magna in the Book of the Dead. I read in the history of Hermes that he founded, he was the founder of Hermopolis Magna, of Al-Ashmunain. And so I read, many volumes of Islamic occultism, primary sources, secondary sources, Al-Buni, Shams al-Ma'arif. I read, very recently, I mean, great tomes by Noah Gardner, if you know him, Liana Saif, who translated the, many, I think she made a translation of Al-Buni as well, and realized that there was more to it. So I started sort of scanning and going through all medieval Islamic texts on magic. And the one that came to my attention was, well, it's known in the Latin world as the Picatrix. In Arabic, it's called Ghayat al-Hakim, the goal of the wise. And it's a compendium of talisman making type of knowledge, ways of making talisman, but then it has a section about the magic performed and produced by different people around the world. The Ethiopians, the Kurds, I think the Belushis, the Persians, different people from around the world, but it was the only book that I found. There's a compendium that had a chapter specifically on the Copts. And this chapter obviously was of great interest to me because the Copts are Egyptians, are the original inhabitants of Egypt. And in this chapter, it talks about how they used to make magic potions, how they have their own magic symbols, one of them being the cross. And I know two very important things that made me understand that this connection was very important. One of them is that this book was known by Ibn Khaldun. Was known by Ibn Khaldun at the time of Ibn Khaldun, which is, more or less, maybe slightly bit later. Sorry, slightly earlier than the construction of this mosque. So we know that this book was in Cairo. So it was known by people like Ibn Khaldun. The other thing that I knew that, some of the Mamluk sultans, I think the first one known to have had an occult library, a portion of his library containing occult texts, was Barkuk. Right, Noah Gardner, I mean, he's done his PhD thesis on the occult library of Barkuk. And so it's very possible, knowing that Dinawari is talking about jinns, is talking about magic, and so is Al-Makrizi, that people involved in the construction of this mosque knew about the Ghayat al-Hakim. The most important passage of the Ghayat al-Hakim for my paper was a passage that mentions Medinat al-Hashmunain. And so I'm going to read this passage and translate it for you. وجعل حول المدينة ثلاث من كل سندف تدفع عن أهلها المدار، وكانت تسمى بالمدينة الأشمونين، وهذا مذكور أيضا في أخبار مصر. هؤلاء الكم آني القبط ساكنون بمصر وهم العارفون بخبر البرابي وطقوشاتها وما أدعى فيها من العلوم. So he, Hermes, created talisman and amulets of all kinds and placed them around the city to keep its inhabitants away from harm. And they called the city Al-Ashmunain. You can find this and other stories in the stories about Egypt, Akhbar Masr, which are known by the Copts who used to live in Egypt and have knowledge of the temples, their talismans, and their science. So obviously this one for me was a bit of a discovery because, so the book is talking about, you know, the city, the temples, the magic and the talismanic power that the Copts had when they presumably build their churches, and that this power of the city goes back to Hermes. And then I found, you know, description of the city with, you know, some sort of automata type of statues. And in the Picatrix, the description is very similar to descriptions that you find, for example, in the Book of the Dead of the same place. So this it's got a long history of association between, you know, the city has got this long history of associations with magic power. Now you'd say, and I found out more about Al-Majriti, Abu Mashar, you know, the Ibn Khaldun attributes this book to Abu Mashar al-Majriti, who wrote about Hermes. And so you would think, you know, that other people would know about this knowledge. Al-Makrizi does talk about the, you know, in his Qitat, he talks about Al-Ashmunain, and he mentions the magic powers of Ashmunain. You know, his entry about Ashmunain is very small. You know, I mean, it's got an interesting mention of a tribe associated with Umayyads that went on ziyarah to Al-Ashmunain. And, you know, the guess is they probably went to ziyarah to see the tomb of Hermes. So there is this, you know, call for an esoteric understanding of why these columns were placed in this mosque. And it's very strong because obviously it's associated with this text that I've just shown you, and the background to the text, and the fact that it was known in Cairo at the time before the construction of this mosque. At the same time, you know, of course, this is a speculation. At the same time, you know, I'm also tempted by the practical pull of this Sultan, who was very much interested in formalities and protocol, and being a Sultan, the distance between people and the ruling elite. So it's very, very complex. You know, I mean, I remember when I sent the paper for review, one of the reviewers came back and said, well, but I mean, I found this article very interesting, but it's why is Sami so afraid to make the statement that this indeed was certainly an esoteric undertaking? Well, simply because there is no final proof. I mean, my tendency will probably go towards that side of things, but at the same time, you know, is very difficult because if the Sultan was involved personally in this, you know, he could have been, but it's also, you know, if you look at his life, you know, it is very complex. He's someone who became Sultan at a very young age. He was interested in different things, but there was that practical pull that makes me think that probably he wasn't directly involved. It could have been that the people who were building this mosque probably did it without him knowing. To think that this was completely a coincidence for me is a bit hard to believe. I simply think that it would have been very hard for them to accomplish this, and there's too much of a coincidence. Yeah, I mean, the other thing that is that the writings of people like Abu Mashar and Al-Buni, they also, I want to talk about also the later stages. So they did influence natural philosophers like Ficino and Campanella, and there's this fantastic book called Knowledge is Power by John Henry. He teaches at Leicester University, if I'm correct. And it's about how, through the vision and science, developed scientific method developed by Francis Bacon, that there is this shift in Europe from magic to science. And he's got a chapter, very interesting chapter, that talks about the influences that John Henry had from the Renaissance, natural philosophers, but also the Islamic type of magic that was filtered to him, through the natural philosophers of the Renaissance. Later on, also in the Islamic world, in Cairo, you have other appearances of other crosses for different reasons in a different period. So obviously, this is not the only instance where this happens in an Islamic monument. It'd be interesting to study all the cases one by one, if one had 3-4 lives. And the last thing that I want to mention is just a sentence I took from Eric Fernie, who also, in a more general way, especially related to Europe, he studied this connubium, this dichotomy between text and monuments and objects. And he says, direct communications with the artifacts of a society provides a means of understanding the society arguably as important as that of the written word. And so complementing the two, I think, is a more comprehensive, holistic way of understanding society, people, and even monuments. I think that's it for me today.
Well, thank you very much, Sami, for this magical and artful talk. I don't think there is a better way to describe how splendid it was. That it was at the level of the objects what you showed us.
Thank you.
which is quite a high thing, given that you showed us some of the best artwork ever made, or actually, well, artwork which is at that level. Yes, which is at that point where there is nothing above. Thank you, Sami. This was amazing. Before we got into the secluded part of the Majlis, where only the secret part, where only those who are now present will participate, because we won't record it. Yes, I just wanted to mention one thing at the beginning, that I remember the when I saw first in Cairo that gate of Akko, and I didn't know, I didn't expect it, I didn't know it, and I saw it, and I was really stunned, and I was, what are you doing here, you gate?
Yes.
You are splendid, but what are you doing here? And then I found out, yes, it wasn't from there. And I think it's also an extremely interesting case of a mirror of what we discuss often in Orientalism, this fascination with the other,
Yes,
and the beauty from the other. And it has a very,
it goes
very,
both
very,
ways, of
yes,
course, of
yes.
course.
So if it was that fascinating, it's like why Muslim Arabic literature and this exotism of it, and especially if
Yeah.
it's that of the enemy,
Yes.
that's and if it's from a church of the enemy, so it's from, yeah, it's the queen of spolia, and I'm
Yes.
using gendered uh, um, speech on purpose here, because it has this acquiring something which is the most important for them.
I mean, it's also that because I mean, the thing is that many people we see, as I mentioned before, the past with the eyes of today. And in some cases, obviously, it couldn't be farther from the truth. And so, you know, many of the craftsmen working in this mosque, for example, were Christians. And we know that. You go to the Dome of the Rock, for example, there's marks of Coptic Christians who worked there as craftsmen. So people didn't really care whether you were Muslim or Christian, if your patron was from a different faith than yours, because they cared about the money. So when you go and see the Mosque of Qalawun, I mean, it's interesting. For example, Creswell talks about the fact, you know, could it be that the craftsmen were Christians? Because when I see this mosque, I enter and I see a Christian sense of space. You know, the acoustics, the fact that it goes up, you know, the stained glass, and you know, I mean, there is some truth in it, I believe. Uh, um, and so people didn't really care about, you know, if you read about Macready talking about the construction of these mosques, and the sultans wanted them to be built, you know, in 5-6 months, very quickly. And so anybody who was passing by the Kasaba, they would just take him and force him to work on it. And so the people who needed the money, for example, at a certain stage were Christians, you know, because they had to pay the jizya and everything else. So they would go willingly to work on them, some of them. So it's not a very black and white situation like we would like to think.
And why the artist works for those who pay them. The patron pays for the quality. They won't
Exactly.
they won't pay
Exactly.
for you for your faith. They want the best. They want the best, or what they can afford.
Exactly.
So I remember we had in White Reynolds talk in the Majlis. It was a splendid example that Muslim musicians played in at services in Christian churches in Spain, which is a splendid example, given, yeah,
Exactly. Exactly.
the very status of music.
Yeah.
It is. Yes. So, but Wille had already a question, and it is about Spain. I think your talk was a great example of also the fact that Spain is exceptional, probably because it became Europe. It became the West again, and then it was much more studied for the convivencia and everything. But this convivencia, as much as it existed, and the examples you brought and the legal background is immensely interesting. But this convivencia was not specific to Spain.
I mean, I think I can't remember the scholar who mentioned this once when I went uh, um, to one talk, and she was saying, no, actually, more than convivencia, sometimes it was a bit about conveniencia.
Yeah. Yes.
You know, so
It may have
it's
been Maribel Fierro, possibly.
maybe
Yeah.
yes. I mean, I even if you read that beautiful book by oh, the lady who passed away, she was a student of Harold Bloom. that talks about, I think, this convivencia, and you know, even there you have examples of brutality, you know, but this happened in Cairo as well. So I mean, you have period of, you know, there's you know, some of the sultans, for example, they were in Cairo were particularly benevolent towards Christians. There was one of them who was a Christian, and then was made a slave and then became a Mamluk Sultan. His brother became a notable in Cyprus, and his own son, the son of the Sultan, was crazy. So he was looking for successors, and he had learned that his brother, his own brother, had twins. And so he brought them to Cairo because he wanted to groom them, maybe for one of them to become the Sultan. But they died, I think, they had a case of cholera or something. And so they were buried as Christians. And so he was very sort of like benevolent towards Christians, also because when he went to Jerusalem, apparently some of the Christian monks were, you know, particularly nice towards him. But then there are cases of people who were very more orthodox, and so saw Christians as a threat, including, you know, their alliances with some Christian rulers of the West. So it's a very, you know, again, as I said before, you know, far from being black and white.
And this includes not just Egypt, but even the East, the Islamic East. There were plenty of Christians.
Yeah,
There are still plenty of Christians there, and they used to be a majority for a very long part of history.
Well, absolutely, absolutely, and not just with Christians, not just with Christians. You know, I mean, Christians, for example, for people in Egypt and Syria, were very useful. You know, they were used as turjuman, and if you go to you know, the funduks that the people had in Venice, for example, the majority were Christians. And if you go to Venice today, you see that, you know, I think one of the biggest family in terms of numbers in Venice itself is Suriano. And this is a family of Syrians, Christians, who decided they never went back. You know, so it's no, it's fascinating, and we know that likewise in Europe, for example, Muslims could not be part of the guilds, and so, you know, the Muslims who did venture to Venice, who did venture to France and other places, they were strictly merchants. They couldn't be part of the society. They probably were restricted in terms of like movements to the funduk. So it's yeah.
And there are, of course, the Jews, and there are also other communities which are less studied. One more thing, actually two more things which I want. Did I understand? I didn't know that. So did Raphael depicted the Dome of the Rock? Did I understand you well?
Yeah, I think there is a painting in Brera in Milan, with a depiction of the temple, but it's obviously the Dome of the Rock. So in a very Renaissance sort of fashion. It's a beautiful one, actually. Yeah.
Because of course the Dome of the Rock is, yeah, it itself, it has this history of Christian
Yes.
craftsmanship, yeah, and the link to the Holy Sepulchre and other materia, and then becoming a Crusader church.
Exactly. Then detransitioning, to use a very apt word of today. So yes.
So yeah, just I want to put into the chat for everyone yes, I'm homesick for Cairo. I will send this. And you made me terribly homesick of Cairo. And then the next Majlis, which is by Oshe Varshani, now starting in less than a week's time, on Arabic Christian notions of human and divine free will. Ammar al-Basri's Kitab al-Masail wal-Ajwiba. So again, this on a very different topic, but still related to this cultural cross-pollination and influences. So I hope everyone will be there next week as well. And yes. Now I conclude the recording, and thank you again. And let's start the question and yeah, the discussion. We are running late, but I don't think we mind that.